So hello, my friends, and thanks for joining us here today on Postscript. I'm happy to have with us Mark Gober. Mark is going to be our speaker at Transition Talks here coming up in November, and we're very much looking forward to having him with us. And I thought we'd sit down and chat a little bit about some of the background, the extraordinary kind of background that he brings to the subject of this big change that's going on in the world. Mark's interesting because I should say, hello, Mark.
Hi, John.
Welcome. All right. Nice to see you again.
You too.
Mark's particularly interesting because I find you interesting, at least, because you come from out of a business and a finance and kind of a background of systems thinking. You can't do investment banking and some of the other things that you've done without kind of considering the whole kind of all of the different kind of components of a system. And Lord knows we're in the middle of a huge kind of systems redesign and upheaval. And so it's marvelous to bring that kind of thinking to the table. You're particularly well known for your series of books, starting with this one called An End to Upside Down Thinking. If I can get it right, it won't be upside down. And this is really quite fascinating because I'm convinced that you can't get to where we're going. You can't deal with a world that operates in a whole new way without seeing it in a different way. I mean, if it's a sideways kind of world relative to where we came from, then you kind of got to look sideways at it. And there are so many of us, we've all been kind of indoctrinated through our education and through our families and through the government and religion and other such things to see these things in this kind of structure that has precipitated the reality that we've got, which is going away. And so it's really wonderful to find another soul who looks at the world in a crisp and kind of clean and fresh kind of way. And so maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about the whole basic ideas about upside down thinking and how that all works.
Sure. Well, that's my first book, and it's the basis of everything I've done since, which is rethinking the way that I used to look at reality personally, but I think also relates to the way that we're taught through the education system and through the media of how we're taught to believe life really is. And during my presentation, I'll go through the details of how I arrived at the conclusion I'll describe now. But basically, I used to think that life was fundamentally meaningless and random. And when you die, that's the end. There's no consciousness, no awareness after that. And it views everything from the realm of just the material. Everything is physical, and there's no transcendent dimension to reality. And the upside down thinking that I was reversing is precisely that in the first book is, well, maybe that view I just described is not correct. Even though I used to operate under those assumptions, maybe there is a transcendent spiritual dimension to reality. That's just the nature of reality itself. And our body is tuning into that. So what
got you to think about it in that way? What happened?
Well, initially I was listening to podcasts that opened my mind. And then I started to read books and realized there was a ton of scientific evidence from very credible places. And it got to the point where I saw enough evidence that I couldn't dismiss it. So I realized I had to shift my worldview. And then I started talking to lots of people in the space, whether they were healers, psychics, just anyone alternative. And I realized there was this whole other world that I had not been aware of.
So it was kind of an evolutionary thing, kind of confronted with an open mind about change that was going on, kind of.
Yeah, it was not overnight. I mean, there were periods where I would come across something that would be more compelling than others, or I'd have personal experiences that were very strange, like synchronicities or talking to people that knew things. But it's been a gradual process. Sometimes it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back when I just return to the regular world. And then I realize, wait, there's a lot more here. And it's ongoing today.
Well, it's certainly upside down thinking from where you came from investment banking and some of those other kind of disciplines that you're going to talk more about when you come here to Berkeley Springs. But You might just give us a quick brief kind of synopsis of the kind of the upside down notion or the ideas that you've come up with.
Sure. Well, the first book, this upside down notion of what's the nature of consciousness, the nature of reality. There's much more than our eyes show us. That's really the first upside down thinking. And then upside down living, the second book, An End to Upside Down Living, explores how would we live life on an individual basis if we had this alternate worldview, which I've come to integrate in my own life. It's really the spiritual awakening path. And then I moved on to a topic that's going to be central to my talk about An End to Upside Down Liberty. So applying these principles of the nature of reality to thinking about structuring society itself. So that means, how should society be governed politically and economically if we apply these metaphysical ideas? And I had to rethink the way I look at government completely. And most recently, I wrote a book called An End to Upside Down Contact, which challenges the idea that we're alone and humans are the peak of existence. And I look at the evidence for advanced life, both in this dimension and elsewhere.
Yeah, that's really great things. I know that you were either aware of or certainly maybe a friend of John Max, who was an old friend of mine back when he was at Harvard. And the whole business of contact and UFOs and things just starts to open up a really big, it punches a hole in the conventional reality big time if once you get to the point where you believe that it's real.
Yes. And I think for those of us who haven't had those kinds of extraordinary experiences, it can be difficult to accept the reality of these things. And I've really had to force myself to look at the research objectively, just like I used to do academically, like I did professionally, like if it were a client, if I just were to evaluate the facts, what does it show? And John Mack's work, which I cover in An End to Upside Down Contact extensively, he was the head of psychiatry at Harvard. And he looked at people that claimed they had encounters with intelligent beings. Sometimes they were actually abducted. And his conclusion was that they were not psychotic. And his first book, Abduction, I mean, he goes through essentially psychiatric case studies on some of the most compelling cases. And as an honest intellectual person, he couldn't shoot them down. He said these people were having some kind of a genuine experience, even if we can't fully understand them.
Yeah, well, this whole business of other life, I mean, it's kind of naive to believe that we're the only ones in the whole universe that are like us. I mean, it makes good religion, but it's probably not very good in terms of kind of being open-minded, certainly not in terms of being open-minded. And I mean, it's hard to kind of look at the stars at night and not think that there's somebody else up there. And I mean, how does that, in your experience, how does that start to change the way you think and how you look at the world?
If I were to summarize maybe the biggest change over the last 6 or so years for me since I started on this journey, it's that there's much more to reality than what our perceptual organs tell us. So our eyes only see a limited sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, for example, and yet it biases our view of the world, even though we only see a little sliver. The same with our hearing. There's lots of frequencies that we can't hear and so forth. So we're limited in terms of what we can actually perceive as a body. But then there's another level of limitation, which is that we're taught certain things in school. We hear certain things in the media. We get a little sliver of reality of what's actually happening in the world. So I've had to kind of force myself to go beyond what my everyday senses are telling me in terms of information and perceptions and say there's a lot more. Even if I'm not actively knowing about it currently, there could be more than meets the eye.
So how do you integrate those two kind of perspectives? How on one hand, we all kind of have our feet on the ground, one presumes, and you look around and you see all of this reality that you can touch and that you can feel and that you've got to deal with, and then there's other stuff going on. And how do you make a transition? How do you integrate the two of those?
It's one of the challenges in this path, and it is accentuated in people that have had some of these extraordinary experiences, whether it's an alleged abduction or a near-death experience state where they're in another realm and they come back and they're forever changed. So something happens to them and they struggle with exactly what you're talking about to a more extreme level because they've viscerally experienced these other dimensions and they come back into the physical world and they have to reconcile the two. So I think the challenge is acknowledging on a psychological level the existence of much more than meets the eye, and applying the principles to the practical everyday living, because we can't deny the physical reality. And I do see that sometimes, that there can be a tendency just to want to go to the transcendent and deny the everyday aspects.
Yeah.
And I think that an integration is really critical.
Yeah, well, how do you do that in kind of practical kind of terms?
There are 4 pathways that I often think about myself and I've talked about, and I've integrated them from the yogic tradition. One is the pathway of knowledge and wisdom. The other is the pathway of selfless service. The third is the pathway of devotion. And the fourth is the pathway of energy practices. And I'll go through each of those briefly. But to me, that's a way of acknowledging and embodying the transcendent while still being in the world. The first, knowledge and wisdom, has been my primary path of just trying to learn as much as I can about the nature of the physical world, but also the transcendent, to just know like what's actually happening. Selfless service is a way of embodying some of these more transcendent principles while in daily life, because if we're all interconnected, which is how I tend to see things now, then serving is an embodiment of that. So that's a way of being in the world and embodying our interconnectedness. The pathway of devotion is one that some have focused on more than I have personally, but it's this idea of having an attitude of gratitude. And some would call it divine love. Some do it through chanting and prayer, but it's a way of being in the physical and acknowledging and being gracious of this extra stuff. And then the energy pathway is something I've started to integrate more in my own life. This can be a wide variety of practices: meditation, breathing exercises, qigong, physical yoga, physical exercise. That's another way of embodiment. And for those who believe that there is an actual energy associated with the transcendent, a spiritual force, which I tend to think is a reality, these energy practices are a way of bringing that into the body. So you're in the body, but you're bringing something that's maybe otherworldly to the daily life.
So how do you, how does that, what's the kind of the net effect of that in terms of how you see the world differently, or see reality differently, or, interact with people in a different way than you used to?
Well, one, since I view all of reality to be interconnected, at some level, each of us is a version of the other. Even though we appear to be separate, there's an element of us that is the same. So that the illusion of separation that I used to have very strongly is dissipating. And therefore I used to treat people well before, but now there's a deeper level of understanding. When I talk to another person, I see another person as another being that is going through a series of challenges, which on a spiritual level is likely to be evolutionary. And we're all going through different facets of kind of the same thing, even though it might manifest differently for each person. So that level of understanding has changed for me.
That's it. That's interesting. Because somehow, for this to be, there's one thing for this to be intellectual, and you understand the logic of it all, and it doesn't make sense. I deal with this in terms of the whole notion of oneness. On one level, I can kind of intellectually understand the concept of being and integrated with everything else and so on, but on a practical kind of everyday basis, everything you look at is something different from, kind of you. And so it's, there's a shift that we're all familiar with here. That's from going from one kind of paradigm, one framework for understanding reality, to a whole nother one. And in kind of Ken Wilber terms, it's a whole on. It's this kind of include and transcend kind of thing that keeps one foot on the ground, if you will, and one foot into a new space that is described in quite different ways.
Yeah, and what you're describing is something I've been grappling with a lot, especially looking at the world around us. How do we reconcile the turmoil with the idea of oneness? How can that paradox be resolved? Because anyone who experiences a transcendent state, there's a very similar message that comes back. They say we can't use words. It might be ineffable to describe what happened, but we are all one at some level. Yeah. And yet there's complete separation in the world. And to me, it relates also to this notion of light, dark, because in the transcendent states, there's often the notion of unconditional love, that it's all one, all love, and it's beyond description. And yet we don't see that in the world. We see light and dark. So To me, they're both true. And the notion of unconditional love is almost like something that we're striving toward while we're in the realm of duality. We're trying to get to that state, even though we're in a realm where there is the light and the dark, and the light and the dark together allow us the opportunity to try to evolve individually and collectively.
So how would you deal, if you take off on that kind of tangent, how is it that you look at things like this war going on in Ukraine or something in kind of terms that are effective in terms of pushing us toward this new track and this new reality?
Yeah. Well, a few things. Number one is that now when I see conflict anywhere, there are two ways of looking at it. One is we can see the suffering that emerges from the conflict, which is real. And then we can also see the growth and the learning that can be enabled. They both exist at the same time. I don't think it's fair to ignore one or the other. So we can see the suffering that's going on, but there might be global learning. There might be learning for that region of the world for ways to resolve things. And it seems to me that something is coming up to be resolved. On an individual level, we might see this through illness or some kind of trauma in one's life. And there can be a tendency, some call it spiritual bypass, to say, well, this is kind of dark, I don't want to look at it. But then it gets to the point where it's so intense and obvious that you can't avoid it anymore. So when I see a big conflict like this, that's one of the things that emerges for me is there's something that can be transcended and cleared. And this is an opportunity in spite of all the suffering that is bringing this to the surface.
Yeah, it really is. And it's clearly moving us into a whole new space. It's just collapsing the kind of legacy systems and the relationships and the understanding, and producing a vacuum, if you will, for the emergence of a whole bunch of new kind of ideas that include this notion of other life off planet, off human, other human, non-human life that exists other kind of places. And so the whole transition. So how do you kind of understand this transition? How is it happening from your point of view?
Yeah. Well, for me, it has started as an intellectual process and somewhat experiential, but just trying to learn it for myself. And the challenge, though, is to try to interpret what's happening in the world in that context, because there's a limitation in terms of what we actually know. So there are lots of inferences we can try to draw, hypotheticals. But through my new lens of looking at life, when COVID happened, for example, that just struck me as some kind of a learning opportunity. Something was going to come up, it was going to cause trauma, but things were going to be exposed. We were going to be able to learn things and evolve through the process. So it seems like there's all this has been intensifying in the last few years, and there was a lead up to it. But from one lens, it feels like more turmoil, but from another lens, maybe our evolution is accelerating, because there are aspects of darkness that have existed on this planet, and deception and some of the not so good things that have existed for a long time, but now they're coming up all over the place, and we're being forced to deal with them and reconcile them. So from one lens, that's troubling. From another lens, maybe our evolution collectively is accelerating so that we can rebuild our society into some kind of a much improved Earth.
Yeah, I'd agree. The problem I have is knowing what is real anymore. There's such sophisticated efforts to kind of manipulate our sense of reality and capture the narrative or such. How do you make sense out of it?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's something I'm appreciating more and more as I learn. I've spent some time, and also in my books, I talk about this MK Ultra programs, mind control. There's sophistication in terms of manipulating consciousness on an individual level, but also using the media. So what I've tried to do is apply a lot of what I used to do in business with my clients, to be an investigator, like a detective, to look at all the different perspectives that are out there and find the pieces of overlap and look at primary sources, because often the media will give little snippets of something. They'll give you a clip of someone's talk. They won't show you the primary source always. And if you really want to know what's going on, it takes that level, what I'm finding, because there is so much deception and omission, often omission. So it's not like it's an outright lie, but they just won't tell you the really important parts. So it takes really an active person to try to, if you want to understand what's happening in the world, you can't be passive. You can't just listen to the headlines. You have to go into it. And then over time, what I found is that you can find some sources that are more credible, others that aren't as credible, and almost like a Venn diagram, find the overlap between the seemingly credible sources.
Yeah, but part of the problem is that these guys are really sophisticated, and so they use all of these things like compassion and other such things as devices to move you, that you resonate with, and you say, "Oh yes, I feel good about that." And
Yeah, you raised a very important point there that I think about more and more these days, because when I wrote my first two books, I was more focused on this notion of compassion that we're receiving from the transcendent states. The people were saying, look, the nature of reality is interconnectedness, and therefore compassion is essential. And it is essential. And at the same time, that can be weaponized by those who understand that there are a lot of people in the world who want to do good. They have good intentions. So they might gravitate toward things that make them feel good, but the end result of what's being pushed is not so compassionate. There's this paradox and almost like a blindness. And in my second book, I talk about, it's called An End to Upside Down Living. I talk about 10 approaches to living life. And one of them is compassion with discernment. Because I did see, even at that time, before I was more aware of other things that I'm aware of now, that there would be people who would achieve these transcendent states, and they'd come back to earth and they would be in a state of unconditional love all the time. They'd be loving toward everyone, which on some level is great. But I quote a woman in my book who achieved that state. And then she let a man into her life for months who manipulated her. And she said it was like a living hell. And she couldn't discern that there was something negative that he was bringing. She just wanted to be all about unconditional love. So it's another paradox of, yes, the compassion's important, but we can't allow it to deceive us.
yeah, each one of these confrontations, if you will, or opportunities give us a chance to move to another kind of level that, again, it's almost like this whole Oneness kind of thing that says you've got to bring along the discernment that you and then kind of integrate it in some kind of better way. You can't just throw away everything that you used to have and try something new. And there are a whole lot of folks who, we all know, who will very well meaning, who are wanting to just leap into another space. And that it just seems to me that you got to do this. There's a kind of an evolutionary expanded awareness kind of process that goes on here that you can't discount governments and people. I don't know. What do you think?
It's an integration process of, some would say it's like both and rather than either or. Like, yes, compassion is important, but we can't let that blind us from things that might not be compassionate. But because we're so compassionate and so drawn because of our empathy to one thing, that shouldn't allow us to blind us to other areas. Or sometimes we see the media steering us to be compassionate for one thing, but then we're so compassionate toward that one thing, then if you look at it from a higher perspective, we're not being compassionate to other people. So it's like, actually net, we're not being fully compassionate. So it's like that constant discernment to look at the bigger picture. Yeah,
the political process is very much like that, where they key off of a certain issue that they're a feeling or a concept that they know that you got a lot of energy around, and then drive it off in a separate way. The issue writ large, it seems to me, is that what you have in this giant kind of transition or shift is a very sophisticated effort by the technology to expand in ways that most people just don't even begin to understand. The technology to be able to control every aspect of your body, such that you get into a space where some people are calling it transhumanism, or where you're essentially controlled by the technology and those who control the technology. And that seems to be one of the big issues here.
Yeah. And I think this issue is what drew me to the topic of liberty for my third book, is that I saw what was happening in the world, that the control systems were trying to dictate how people lived in many ways. And we're now seeing a push for the integration of technology with that, for full surveillance of everything that people do, all in the name of safety. It's for your own benefit. It's for the greater good, is what people are told. And yet there is real potential downside, not only from the physical standpoint of not being free to do things. And in other countries, we see this to a more extreme level, like in China, where there's more of a social credit system, where if you have a wrong opinion, then you're less able to function in society, but also on the level of spirituality. reality, if technology gets integrated into our bodies, or if our consciousness is getting steered in a certain direction, then we might have a limited evolutionary experience, which to me is a real spiritual threat if we are here to evolve in certain ways, and yet the technology might hold us back.
I think that's a key kind of notion that came to me quite some time ago, and that is that there are these big efforts that are going on to control or constrain humanity in a variety of ways. They're all anti-evolutionary, and it's against the essence of what the whole species is about. Is that the idea is that we're supposed to get bigger and better and broader and higher and such, and yet there is all this very sophisticated effort to try to kind of tamp everything down. How does that work?
Well, it seems to me that some people want to control because they want to play God. And in some cases, maybe they don't have any spiritual belief, so that's their almost religion. And in other cases, maybe they just have a warped view of spirituality, and they're so concerned about whatever the threats are that it's really out of their compassion, so to speak. They think they're being compassionate because they want to control people, because that's actually going to help them. And I think that misses the idea that people should be able to take risk on their own terms. And if they make a mistake, that's their own evolutionary journey. It's not someone else's job to force them to do something. And that's not to say one can't make a recommendation, but we're not seeing that these days. We're seeing like, no, you need to do this. And if you don't, then you're a pariah.
Yeah, and the trick is, how do you navigate that space? How in fact, in the face of all this technology and these kinds of perspectives and points of view, how do you find that kind of sweet spot in the middle of this that allows you to transcend into this new area?
To me, it starts with the awareness from as many people as possible that this is actually happening and that there is a danger to it. Because I know many people, they're not thinking this way. And I could see how that could happen very easily. If you're just looking at the headlines, you're busy with taking care of your family and your job, you might not be thinking about the danger of what's happening at a more rapid rate, but it's been happening for a long time. So I think people waking up to this is really critical, because the more people wake up to this, the less tolerant they will be of some of the mandates and dictates that come down, because they'll say this doesn't make sense. And if people push back more, then I think there's a chance that we can evolve past this. On the other hand, if everyone just complies to every word, even if it's not to our advantage, then we could be in trouble.
How do you see this large kind of transition? How do you frame that from your point of view?
It seems to be happening on multiple levels. So there's a spiritual transformation, clearly, which is where I started my journey. But that doesn't fully capture some of the transformations on the planet in this dimension, so to speak, of the political structures, of the media, of education, the way we actually run life on the planet. That's its own transformation too, on a more practical level. So it's almost like there are multiple transformations at once, different forms of awakening that we need to embark on. And in some way, that's a really good thing, because there are lots of aspects of our planet that many of us don't like, and this is a chance to rebuild.
Yeah. You sit on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and Willis Harmon used to run that operation for a long time, and he was a good friend of mine, and I used to go out to San Francisco and have lunch with him once a month for a number of years. And he wrote a book called Global Mind Shift, is it, or Mind Change? I can't remember which. And the underlying principle was that you cannot get this new world, you cannot get to a higher level of awareness, you cannot make it through this shift without a commensurate kind of repositioning or a reorganization of your understanding. You have to have a shift in who you are, which then drives what you do and what you value and other such things. And how in the world, in the middle of all of this, do you think you navigate through this to be able to do that when there's so much effort and sophistication going into trying to carry you off in the direction that the technocracy wants?
Well, to me, it starts with the intention to understand the truth at all times, and then to orient one's compass toward that. So priorities and values and the things that we do in life tend to be based on the way that we view reality. So to me, the quest to understand the truth of reality is the starting point. And the more of us that do that, we might see a more of a collective shift. And we don't know how many people or to what extent an individual will have to make a shift for there to be a global shift. So the notion that people talk about often is the butterfly effect, where a butterfly flapping its wings in China, for example, mathematically can cause a hurricane in New York. Small changes can have non-linear effects. So that's how I look at it, is basically the best we can do is work on ourselves individually, try to be as discerning as we can, elevate our own consciousness, and try to help others do that. And then the outcome we can't control, but what we can control is our own intention.
Yeah, well, trying to figure out how this reality works is a non-trivial kind of effort. How do you think this reality works?
Well, first of all, I think we're limited in terms of what we can know. And an analogy I often draw towards is from the novella Flatland, where people are living on a flat two-dimensional world like a piece of paper. And if you imagine a three-dimensional sphere interacts with that two-dimensional piece of paper, you get a circle. So
That's
everyone
right.
on the piece of paper living in two-dimensional land, they look at that and they say, look, it's a circle. No, it's actually a sphere. So a big part of the whole process is to acknowledge that we're limited, that we can maybe understand the circle, but we're never going to be able to fully comprehend the sphere living in two-dimensional land. So the term is often regarded as radical humility or intellectual humility. To me, that's a starting point, is look, we're limited in what we can know, but then having the curiosity just to try to learn as much as we can. And for me, I get drawn to certain passions that I can't always explain, of just things I want to learn about. So what I think is the case for maybe each soul on the planet is that we're here to do something and evolve in a certain way. And when we have a big passion towards something, there's a reason for it that we might not understand, and to follow that passion and whatever we want to understand and live out, because there might be a transcendent reason for it.
Yeah. Do you think, you've written this book about contact, do you think that extraterrestrial life is more than just aliens? Is it spirits? And how does that integrate? How does that all work from your point of view of this reality?
When I wrote the book, An End to Upside Down Contact, I was looking at all forms of contact that humans have with other intelligences. So I was looking at it from the perspective of this dimension, the physical world, and then also other dimensions of reality. And the outcome of that research project for me was that there are many species of beings, some of which may be purely physical, others are etheric in other dimensions, some maybe are both, and they might be on other planets and in other dimensions. And within species, you might have some beings that have different intents. So it's a very complicated picture the deeper I go into this. It's difficult to know exactly what's happening, but it does seem that the beings are interacting with this planet, various species, and maybe it's in ways that we don't always see, because if there are other dimensions that we're tapping into with our brain, if the brain's almost like an antenna, then we might be tapping into elements of consciousness, like the thoughts that are coming in or emotions that we don't recognize are from an external source. So I think it's a much bigger picture than just someone's abducted or they encounter a ghost. There's a bigger play here.
What do you think that is? I mean, in broader kind of terms. I mean, where are we going, I guess, and what is the picture of reality that you think starts to come out of this?
To me, it's something related to the overall evolution of the universe, of consciousness collectively. And we do that by our individual evolutions, both as human beings, but also as any other being as well. So to me, they're evolving in some way too, through their own unique experiences. So we're all doing that together and trying to evolve toward the state that people describe as unconditional love. That's ultimately how I see it.
Well, how does that work in practical kind of terms?
In practical terms, it appears to work through messiness, through this dark light. And it doesn't always look pretty, but that lack of prettiness is what helps us to evolve. You can't appreciate the light as much without the darkness. The contrast is what allows for that to happen.
Yeah, if you don't have if you're not confronted with problems or issues or so on, then you won't do anything. I mean, you'll sit back and eat bonbons or whatever you've got no in there, you have no interest in moving forward because everything's okay. And so it seems to me that the kind of the essential mechanism of the evolutionary process is being confronted with and solving and dealing with any number of kind of issues or problems, or however you want to describe them in life. And by the way, I would say that there are no problems. What they all are opportunities to try to see yourself and see the world in a different way.
Yes. Two things I'll say to that. One is, you're reminding me of the notion in spiritual awakening called the dark night of the soul, where a person has maybe had been fighting their evolution in a certain way, but then things get so bad to the point where they can't ignore it anymore, that they have to evolve past something. And that seems to be a universal principle, not just individually, but also collectively. And also your point, which I think is really important, about problem versus opportunity. It's a matter of perspective. And I often think about it like we're walking through a maze and we can only see what's immediately in front of us. But if you had a helicopter's perspective, it could see the whole maze. You'd understand that what appears to the person in the maze as a problem is really an opportunity from the broader perspective.
Yeah, it is. I had an experience in quite a few years ago, as a matter of fact, and I was walking down the street of Prague with a Dutchman friend of mine, and I was bitching and moaning about George Bush, little George Bush, and what a jerk he was, and so on. And this guy said, "Well, maybe he's the shortcut," and I said, "What do you mean, the shortcut?" He said, "Well, he might be the shortcut." And I said, "Well, I don't know what that means." Well, he said, it's kind of like he's the shortcut. And I said, "Wait, what are you talking about?" Well, he said, "Well, maybe, he's the guy who everybody looks at and they respond to him, and that drives the system back the other kind of way." And wow, a big light went off in my head. And I said, "What the hell? If you were up here playing cosmic chess and you were trying to look at this, well, of course you'd do a George Bush and then a Barack Obama, and you play this back and forth." And so it's, you get down into the weeds where everybody's trying to keep you driven by the politics and entertainment and whatever it is, and you miss the big picture about where this is going and how it's going.
Yeah, it sometimes feels like we're walking around with a blindfold. We don't know exactly what's going on or why things are happening. And I like that perspective of opportunity rather than problem. I try to look at everything in my own life and also the world that way, is what can be learned from the situation, as dire as it might seem at certain times. There must be something that we can learn to transcend it.
Well, yeah. And by the way, you won't learn it if you don't think that there's a learning opportunity there, or in many cases, or in most cases. Certainly at the time of confrontation. I mean, maybe in retrospect, you look back and say, "Oh, well," but it's a real shift. It's part of this global mind shift, it seems to me, is that there's this immediacy and this not only immediacy in terms of constantly saying, "What's this about and what am I supposed to learn?" and so on, but there's also an arm's length kind of aspect of it, to where you're kind of an observer and looking back and trying to get the bigger kind of picture. It's a really it starts to put you in a different way. So you kind of by the way, it takes a lot of kind of conflict and judgment and everything out of the whole kind of process, because you start to realize everybody's being offered these opportunities to learn, and there's all this stuff going on that you don't understand. And so it's a fascinating kind of process.
Yeah. And what I've noticed since COVID is that now more and more people are focused on these global issues than they were before, because it was easier to avoid them previously. At least in my own life, I found that to be the case. I could just focus on my job, write the book, and then be in my own little silo. All of a sudden that you couldn't do that anymore. The world was interconnected in a different way, and there was crisis everywhere. And it's felt like that for the last 2+ years. So the advantage of that is that it's expediting evolution, because everyone's being forced to wake up in their own way, wherever they are in their journey.
Yeah, we follow Martin Armstrong here a bit, who is an economist down in Florida, who has got a computer program that he developed 40 years ago, and that's built upon the kind of the cyclical nature of all the different aspects of life. And it turns out to be completely, I mean, it's never been wrong in 40 years in terms of the financial markets and economic things, as well as even political stuff and so on. And what he kind of sees on the horizon is the likelihood that, you know, he says World War III starts in about February of next year, and that by 2025 and 2027 you have a global civil war, where there's a general uprising across the planet of people up against their governments. And you can get kind of myopic about that, and you can say, oh no, what am I going to do, and how do I prepare, and how horrible is this? But if you then back away from it a little bit, you say, well, how does the old system collapse that allows the emergence of the new system if the old system doesn't collapse? I mean, it's kind of like you can't get there from here without that's kind of significant disruption.
Yeah. It's a metamorphosis that has to happen. And there's so many pieces to the puzzle that what you're describing makes sense, because you couldn't just have an overnight shift where it's like utopia the next day.
Yeah.
That's not how our physical reality works. It's typically gradual with fits and spurts along the way, but it's not from 0 to 1 immediately.
No, it does. Nobody wakes, everybody doesn't wake up some morning and see the world in a different kind of way. It's a very ragged kind of leading edge as this goes forward, which adds interest to the whole process. Well, we're really looking forward to having you with us on the 19th of November here in Berkeley Springs and on live stream. And we're going to talk about a whole bunch of other kind of things that we don't have the time to deal with here, in particular about how government could be redone. I mean, I really like your notion that that says that the structure and the organization of government is essentially antithetical to human beings. Yep. And so we'll talk about that here, when you get here. But there are this, I'll just go back and say again that this amazing kind of transition and this kind of shift we're going through dictates, it requires thinking in a new way. The world we have right now is a product of the way we think. That's kind of obvious, right? Our principles and our values and our presumption about how history and reality works and all these kinds of things come together to allow to shape the decisions that we make. And so we get what we think, what we think, how we think, essentially. And so the whole idea of thinking about this thing in your terms of upside down in a radically new kind of way is kind of central, it seems to me, to navigating our way through these very, very interesting times.
Yeah, it's central, and it takes a big leap. I know that in my own life, it was very disorienting to turn my whole worldview upside down. And I continue to do that in different areas that I look at. And it requires a willingness to do that, to realize, wait, the things I used to believe might not be true. And therefore I have to recalibrate my belief systems. And what I found is that not everyone wants to do that, but those that do want to do it, it can be a transformative experience.
Of course it can, but you have your whole sense of security and your sense of self is tied into those structures and those relationships and those processes and the principles that you've all grown up with. And so how do you kind of work your way out of that into a new space?
Yeah, well, what I found is that what I used to regard as certainties are much more flimsy than I used to think they were. I used to think there was a fixed sense of what the nature of reality was, and I was okay within that box. But that those assumptions were not true. So to stick with that old view of reality could actually be dangerous because it ignores what else is out there. And you're reminding me actually of a conversation I've had with a friend when I presented a lot of the information I came up with in my first book about the nature of consciousness, the nature of a spiritual dimension. he said to me, Mark, you might be right. The scientific evidence you're talking about seems like it's mind blowing, but my life is pretty good the way it is.
Yeah.
And I don't want to rock the boat. And to me, the reality is, if we reject reality for what it is, then reality will rock us in some way. So it's best to just get with the program.
Well, that's a key point here, because if you capitulate to all of the forces from the outside, you're going to watch television, and you're going to follow football and baseball, and you're going to drink beer, and go to Netflix and watch. I mean, they will get you into this machine. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different kind of machines. There's a political machine and there's a healthcare machine and so on. And they just grind you along into that thing. And this notion that you have to extricate you got to walk yourself out of it. How do you do that? Because if you're not kind of naturally inclined to do that, if you don't question everything from, I don't know, long ago, you came to the conclusion that as you had to kind of question everything, how do you kind of get off the fence and get into the new space?
Yeah. Well, for me, it happened in a very serendipitous way. In hindsight, I came across podcasts that led me down a road and I was willing to follow it. So I think willingness is a really important part of it. But then to me, the onus is on those of us that have this understanding, even if it's not fully complete, to try to make the information as available as possible, because that might increase the probability that someone will come across it and have their own awakening, or at least the first domino in that awakening. So it's the willingness on behalf of the participant who is having the awakening, but then the rest of us to try to help that process in whatever way we can.
Yeah, it's almost like I'm not very much interested in the kind of being evangelistic about all of this.
Yeah.
It's my problem that comes from my background in this kind of conservative religious background where I came from originally. Yeah, I'm sure. And so I'm not, but we need to kind of, it's more like, I guess if you want a metaphor, is a light, that you have a beacon, if you will, and people can see it and they can come and they can, if they're so interested and they're ready, because all of us are surrounded by wonderful people who we love that just don't see the world in the same way that we do. And so in a sense, you just kind of, it seems to me you need to traverse your own space, your own path. You need to kind of go down where you need to go down and have kind of love and acceptance for everybody else who's trying to make their way through the process as well. And they're at different stages.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I look at it as well. And part of the reason I write books and do talks like this, and I did a podcast series, is to make the information available. So the light is there if you want to go towards it, but not forcing it on people, making it available without forcing. Because like you say, everyone's on a different evolutionary journey. And for some people, maybe that information is not what they need. And I know in my own path for the last several years, certain pieces of information that matter to me now didn't matter a few years ago.
Yeah.
And how can you know where someone else is on the journey? So forcing it is not the way. And I found that personally, it doesn't work, number one, and it's not beneficial for anybody, but making things available and it's like a light is spread in that process. To me, that is a way out of this.
Well, you make an interesting and useful point about the timing of all of this, because as you move yourself forward into this, then you see the world. I mean, by definition, you see the world in a broader way. You see, you have this expanded awareness, which then brings in kind of other opportunities and possibilities. And you go further and you're very rapidly moving yourself away from where you used to be. And by the way, where everybody else is kind of, or a lot of other people. And so it's an interesting kind of process of personal development. And it's about development of self, essentially who you are. And when you figure that out a little bit, then it really makes it a lot easier to kind of move into this new space.
Yeah. And
Well,
yeah,
go
one
ahead.
analogy quickly. This was a transformative realization I had a few years ago. The analogy on an airplane where you put your oxygen mask on first before you help other people. That's essential. That the personal individual work is paramount. And then the service can come once you're in a really good place and you have a good understanding. But just trying to go straight for the service without the personal solidness can be problematic.
Yeah, yeah. Very good point. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mark Gober, for being with us here today and chatting a little bit about some of your 4 books on seeing the world from a new perspective, that is to say, an upside down thinking, and from your point of view. And we're very much looking forward to having you with us here in Berkeley Springs on the 19th of November, when you're going to talk about this whole idea about how governance and how freedom and other kinds of things really work in this new world where you look at things in a different way. So it's very practical and very useful, particularly as we look around and watch everything implode around us right now, which is wild and crazy. But thanks so much. And it's great to talk to you. And we're looking forward to having you with us. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, John. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, take care. Bye.